The single biggest thing I think that will prevent nuclear war is the inflation that we're feeling. And the reason is because it allows the Fed, in my opinion, for the first time really in the last 15 years, to act properly. And if they hold the line and they take interest rates to 4 or 5%, I think one non-obvious outcome of all of that is that it becomes extremely expensive, next to impossible, to finance military adventurism abroad. And that's a practical economic outcrop of really meaningfully high rates greater than zero. And so I actually think the reality is that for a lot of these governments, the more that inflation sticks around, the stickier it is, the higher rates are in general, the bigger the problems at home are, and the less prone they're going to be likely. I actually think that explains the escalation of this rhetoric, because people want to try to make this issue and put it on the table. But you understand that these folks don't say it's a 90% likelihood. They go from 1% to 25%, which, if you understand probabilities, is effectively a left tail risk that's effectively the same. And the reason they're trying to do it is they're trying to get it back, David, as you say, to timestamp it, to get it in front of people's perspectives, to make it important in a moment where everybody increasingly, not just in the United States, but in the UK, in Europe, are looking internally and trying to figure out how to keep their economies in a reasonably functioning way and how to make sure that their financial and other infrastructure keeps working.
So you're saying...
And that is not necessarily a priority when rates are zero. But when rates are 4%, just by the way, if you guys saw what happened today, it was the competing of two narratives this week. There was the financial narrative of the UK having to bail out their pension system, right? Of all of a sudden the pensions being forced sellers, of those forced sellers now spilling into the United States debt markets around CLOs and collateralized loan obligations and junk debt, which then could theoretically spill as a contagion into other parts of the market. That was narrative one. And all of that, by the way, is a result of hiding inflation and the Fed moving up rates and other countries being forced to attack inflation with higher rates and creating all these dislocations. Narrative one. Versus narrative two, which is, hey, all of a sudden we have to put the nuclear risk on the table. And if you actually saw the print that was spilled, the disproportionate amount of the rhetoric actually focused on the former narrative and not the latter. And so I think that's why these folks are escalating the rhetoric in order to create an equality so that they get enough print on that version of the outcome. I would guess that the next $500 billion to $1 trillion that is spent in Western world economies will be to subsidize something that's broken internally inside of one of our countries, whether it's the UK pension system or whether it's the high yield credit markets, and it will not be to finance military adventurism in Russia.
People just to underscore that point. So there's an article today in the Washington Post about how the U.S. government's debt service is going to be around $570 billion this year, which is a 45% increase. Biden's budget for 2023 is only $1.6 trillion. So you're talking about something like over a third now of the official budget is already going to debt service.
Because it's on variable. It's a variable,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. Because so much of it is, it's not locked in long-term rates. So because interest rates have gone up so much, the debt service has gone up and interest rates are still going up. And Druckenmiller had those points around how the debt service within a decade is going to eat up practically the whole federal budget. In the past, it was just, let's just do both and we'll rack up more national debt. I do think there will be more and more pressure to question this type of spending and why we've already given Ukraine $80 billion in handouts when we can't afford to basically pay for major entitlements at home. So I think there'll be more pressure. Now, I don't know if that pressure is going to come in time, though, to de-escalate this Ukraine war.
It's not.
And that's what concerns me. And just to cut to the chase on this, I think where the rubber meets the road on Ukraine is Crimea.
I think the most important thing that we can all be thankful for, which I think will prevent a lot of wars in the next 10 or 20 years, is inflation and non-zero interest rates. It's just going to be really tough. The UK cannot do anything right now other than make sure that they have foreign currency reserves to back up the pound, which they don't really have that much. They're going to need money to bail out their pension system. Whoever thought it was a good idea to allow pensions to run levered risk it's obviously insane. Could you imagine if it turned out that the teachers' pensions and the firefighters' pensions in America were running levered long?
Oh, they are.
They're not.
This has to get resolved now. It's just we're at a breaking point.
No.
Yeah, it's clear.
You know what a pension is?
I know. I'm not trying some fancy.
Yeah, it's just a dead instrument.
No, I'm saying don't use some fancy intellectual argument. I'm saying practically speaking, the treasurer is not allowed to call Goldman Sachs and say, I'm going to run 2 turns of leverage on this money. That is not allowed to happen in the United States, okay? I get in some fancy way it could be thought of as levered long with all kinds of indirection, but that is not how the world works today. A treasurer in a UK pension system is allowed to call an investment bank and actually run levered. That is insane. Okay, so my point is, when rates are non-zero, all of that jig is up. Governments are forced to batten down the hatches and husband cash for God knows what will break in the system. And I think that is, and as disruptive as that is, it may actually be the bulwark against war. I'll say 3 quick things. One is that today, Thursday, October 13th, we had an inflation print which was worse than expected, and the markets are materially higher.
Strange. Why?
We talked about this a few weeks ago. My thought then, and it's the same that I think now, is that we've effectively seen the near-term bottom and we're now consolidating. And so every opportunity people have to justify that most of the news is behind them, they take and they use that as a reason to buy. Okay, so that's number 1, which is that we are near the end. The second, however, is that if we do see another leg down, there is really only one cohort of company that hasn't been really whacked. And I'll summarize it very quickly by saying it's Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, and Google. That's it. Even Facebook has now been put into the bucket of everybody else, where we've been crushed 60, 70, 80% in those companies. So what does that mean? Well, those 4 companies are now being identified for what they may be, which in capitalism is called over-earning. Okay? They are making more money than we think is appropriate. This letter from Andy Jassy is his way of effectively telling his major shareholders that he is now moving the business to become more of a cash cow business. Tim Cook made this incredible decision in 2016, 17, 18 that effectively did the same thing. That's when Buffett came in. That's when he established a huge ownership in the stock. That's when the stock absolutely ripped because it moved into a different bucket in people's minds. It became growth at a pretty reasonable price. And I think Andy is making the case that Amazon is going to become one of these GARP stocks, growth at a reasonable price. He's going to keep expenses nominal. He's going to return a ton of cash to shareholders with buybacks. That's the reading in between the lines of that letter. I think it's a really profound statement and a very smart move because you haven't seen that letter or a version of that letter yet from Microsoft. And you started to see hints of that letter from Sundar, where he said, and he's
saber rattling. Yeah.
He's not there yet. He's in the appetizer part. He's in the amuse-bouche where he's like, guys, you got to work harder. Hey guys, let's create some fancy acronyms. But Sundar's got courage. No, but he's got courage. He is going to rip the Band-Aid off too. And so I think what it means is these 3 and maybe these 4 companies are going to draw a hard line in the sand and say, we are not over-earning. Do not abandon this stock. That again will help put in a bottom in the stock market.